video. The first video was our first hour of class, and for hours 2 and 3, WebEx recorded the audio, but it didn't record the screen capture, even though my screen sharing was on, which means I had to actually redo those that hour and a half of video. I kind of condensed it down, so there's only 2 videos from lesson 2. So I didn't miss anything. I was able to kind of combine that last hour and a half, which on Wednesday was split into 2 separate videos, parts 2 and 3. I combined those into a single new part 2 video. So if you're looking for the third video from last week's lesson, because there's part of the lesson you want to see, there is no third video now. I re-recorded it the following day. So just actually, before we get into views, there is one thing I noticed. A number of students, I don't recommend this, but a number of students in your assignment repositories created the repository and created the README file on GitHub. I don't recommend this because you should create the README file in Visual Studio. And the reason for this is if you create the README file first on GitHub, then you don't have that file on your computer and there can be a mismatch. So I'm going to go through this process to show you how, if you create the repository first on GitHub, how do we then get our Visual Studio project uploaded to it? Because a lot of you have an empty repository with just a README file. So I'm just going to walk through this process. So I'm going to go to GitHub first, and I will create a repository. And I will create it with the README file just because that's what many of you did. I'm going to go here. I'm going to make a new repository. You can follow along with me if you like. And I'll just call it, I don't know, test. Time is 11:06. I'll make my repository private, not that this matters. And many of you checked the add a README file. Now, last week in class, I created the README file in Visual Studio as part of my solution. I would recommend you do it this way, but many of you created it here on GitHub. So if you did, that's okay. I'm going to walk you through the process. So you've created the repository. Whoops, that's odd. My README file wasn't there. Whoops. That wasn't very smart. I thought I checked README, but I'm going to do it again. Whoops. That's okay. I'll delete this one. I will restart this. Coffee hasn't quite kicked in yet. It's now 11:08, private, and I want a README file, which I thought I checked last time, but okay, so now I have a README file here, and notice I have a branch called main. Now I'm going to go to Visual Studio. I'm going to create a new project, and then I want to connect it up and push it to my repository. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio. This is just a kind of a throwaway test project. I'm not actually going to do any real work in it. I'm just going through the process of setting up your assignment and getting the code up on GitHub. So then I'll create a new project, and I'll pick all the same options now that we've picked in the previous 2 weeks. So I'm going to just pick from my recent project template, ASP.NET Core Web App using MVC. And I noticed a few of you already did this and already pushed your code to GitHub, and that's great. But many of you, you just created the repository because that was all I asked you to do for part A. So I'll click Next, give it a name. So I'll call it, kind of match my repository name. I just called it test 1108. I'll change my authentication from none to individual accounts. We'll leave the HTTPS configuration enabled, and I'll just click Create. So this scenario is a little different. Last week in class with my .NET Drink store, I didn't create the repository first on GitHub. I actually created the repository directly through Visual Studio. But the process is a little bit different if we've already got a Git repository. And you do because I asked you to create the Git repository and to invite Eduardo and me as part of your assignment submission for Part A. So now I've got this repository here with a Readme file. And now I've got a web project in Visual Studio with our MVC skeleton. So how do I connect them up? Because I don't want to create a new repository. I want to link my local repository to my GitHub repository. It's actually quite simple. So the way to do this is go to GitHub, copy the URL of your online GitHub repository, and then if through the Git menu, I'll choose Create Git Repository. And the default here, it says, well, we want to create a new repository. Or I'm going to change this and choose Existing Remote. I don't need to create this repository. It already exists. So I'll click on Existing Remote. And now it says, okay, what's the URL to this repo? So I can just paste it in. So if I click the Create and Push button, that's now going to link my local project to the GitHub repository I created, and it's going to push the code instead of to the main branch, it's going to push it to a new branch called master. So I'll click Create and Push. Now I can see it's connected to the master branch. And if I go back to GitHub and refresh, right, it says master has had a recent push. So my README file is here. If I change my branch, if I change to the master branch, now my project is here. So you'll want to go through this same process if you've already created a repository on GitHub and you haven't pushed any of your code from Visual Studio. Maybe you haven't even built your assignment project yet. I didn't ask you to, didn't require it at this point. So once you create the assignment, in order to connect it up to the repository you've made and invited Eduardo and I to, you'll just go to Git. You'll choose Create Repository and you'll change from a new repository to an existing remote. And then you just paste in the URL to that repository and push, all your code is here. Okay, so if you need to reference this, right at the start of the lesson 3 video. Okay, does anybody have any questions about this? I know from reading the discussion board last week, lots of people said, yes, Adam, you should have the git ignore. Visual Studio will create it automatically. And the reason we want the git ignore is because our project can often have a number of dependencies, and these list of dependencies can get really large. So we don't need these to be included in our project. So git ignore will remove all the dependencies. Okay. I will show one more time. Now, Kripa, I did show it. It is recorded in last week's video, but to create the README file, I will do it again here. So if you create your repository without the README, which is what most of you did, which is fine, that's what I would recommend. If you just right-click your solution, well, actually, this one isn't going to work because I've already got a README file online. So I'm going to need to create a new project, which is fine. So I'll make a, whoops. I'll close my solution. Once again, I will make test 1114. So I'm making my project in Visual Studio with individual user account and HTTPS. So this is just a local project. It's not, there is no Git repository yet. So before I do, I'm going to right click my solution and I'm going to add a new item, which is a text file. And I'll call the text file readme.md. So all caps for the file name, lowercase for the extension. I'll just put in this is the readme file. And I'll save my change. So now I want to upload the entire thing to GitHub. So I can go to Git, create a Git repository, and it brings up this window. So all I have to do here, it's going to create a repository with the same name as my project, which I can change if I need to. I could enter a description. I want it to be private. And then I can just click create and push. I'll save my changes. And now if I go back to my GitHub homepage and go to my repositories, here's my project, test 1114. It's got my whole project with my README file. Kripa, does that help? So it's quite simple. No problem. So I've done this in both this week and last week's lesson. So I noticed a number of people in the discussion board talked about how they really liked learning how simple it was to use Git within Visual Studio, which I totally agree with. It makes our life super simple to create repository, push our code, and then push updates. So anytime I make any changes here, I'll just go back to Git changes, add a commit message and click commit all and push, and I'm done. Super easy. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our .NET Drinks project from last week. And I want to get my project running in the browser. So what is the best option for doing that? We want to start up our server for today. There's a few ways we can do it, but one way is probably optimal. How do we get our little project running? You got it. Thanks, Chris and Connor. So debug, we'll choose without debugging because that way it's not going to lock our code window. So here's our app. And last week we created and played around with, I think I just need to close the Miro board. All right, someone's feeling powerful. Unfortunately, it won't handle a video, I don't think. I got to close the board for now because it seems to be messing with my internet connection. So last week, what did we do, right? We created a model called brand. Okay, Jillian, I think it's just slowing down my internet, that's all. I'll have to go back and play it after. Thanks. So we defined a brand as having an ID, a name, and a year founded. And then in our index method, we created a list. We mocked up 5 brand objects and we passed this list to the view. In our index view, we declared a model. So this page receives some strongly typed data. It receives an IEnumerable, a list of brand objects. And then we could use a loop to display the name and the year, and we made the names a link. So our data that we mocked up in the controller gets rendered in our view. We can click on any one, and we're passing the name to the details page. So our focus today is on views, so we're going to do a few things. We're going to try creating a strongly typed view, a different kind of strongly typed view. You guys are going to do a little exercise in small groups, exploring some of the syntax, and then I'm just going to go over a few kind of new things to know about and be aware of when we're looking at using views in ASP.NET. And then lastly, hopefully before we have time, we're going to make sure that everybody can set up a SQL Server database. We'll do that at the end of class today. So what we want to do is, so we had this one view that actually has this model declaration. It works with some kind of data, and we defined which model class it works with and how it's going to interact. It's going to display a list, so it uses this IEnumerable construct. So Visual Studio offers a number of different templates for creating views to do different kinds of interactions with the model. So we're going to experiment with this a little bit. So let's go to, just close up some of the things we don't need. Let's go back to our brands controller from last week. If your file's probably open already. If not, in Solution Explorer, you can find it under the controllers. So open up your brands controller. And we want to set up a method that when an HTTP GET request is made to brands/create, what do you think should happen? So we'll define our method, first of all. It's going to return an IAction result, and I want to talk about this as well for a minute. Create. And just like our other two methods, when we get a GET request at /brand/create, we want to return a view. So far, this looks exactly like the other methods that we defined so far when we first created them. Right? We create a method name in Pascal case, it returns an IAction result, and our method is going to load return a view. It's going to load a new page in the user's browser. Now I want to talk about this IAction result class because we've been working with it. And many of you, thank you for those of you who contributed to the discussion board. So there was a discussion question at the end of class last week asking you, what did you learn in this week's class and what do you want to learn more about? And a few people actually mentioned this IAction result. I want to know a little bit more about it. What does it actually do? So let's have a look at what Visual Studio is telling us. So it's an interface. We got a good clue because it starts with the letter I. So IAction result is an interface. It's a contract that represents the result of some kind of action method in an MVC framework. So far, we've always been returning the exact same type of object, right? We've been returning a view in every case. What other kind of action result could we return? What else could we do in a controller method besides returning a web page? Returning a view is the most common way to implement this interface, but there's something else. Have any other ideas what we could return instead of a view? Adam, that's a really good question. I'm not sure about that. Okay, we could return database information. Right. Okay, so if we just wanted to return raw data, we could. What format do you think typically we would use to pass the data? How would we structure the data? You guys are on the right track. Okay, so we could pass a model object back. Yep, that's possible. We're actually going to do this later in the course. Let's go here for a second. So we're going to build something like this. Here's Spotify's API, right? We can make a GET request to this URL. What format? This is what we're going to get back. What format is this? Right, as JSON. So we can, in our controllers, and we're going to do this later in the semester, we're going to build a web API. So we'll still have controllers that interact with the database using our model, but instead of returning some kind of user interface, we're just going to return data in JSON format. It might be a list, it might be a single object. So where Booger, you've set a model, yes, it would be a model, but converted to JSON. The other thing that we might return, so we might return a view, we might return JSON, we might also return some kind of error code. So for example, something like so this would allow us to return 404 would be a not found. Yeah, bad request. Which would be a 400. So let's say, for example, we might want to evaluate in our details method. Actually, we can even try that one. That's a good idea, Bugra. Let's implement a bad request here. Let's say if we don't get any name parameter in our details method, we want to return a bad request response, right? So if we go here, if there is no name, right now we get this, maybe we want to return bad request instead. So we can say if name is null, return so if we don't get a name, we're going to send a bad request response. And then we're returning here, so our code will stop executing. If we do get a name, we'll put it in the view bag and return the view. So let's try this method this way. If we just add this little if statement, whoops, I didn't copy that. We add this little if statement into our details view. Let's see what happens. So if I try to load my brand details view, we try to call the method, but name is empty. So we don't actually see a response, but if I go to my browser console, whoops, wrong one, sorry. If I go to my network and refresh, okay, you got a 400. Right, I get a 400 response in Firefox. I had to look. So it tells me bad request without any kind of name. So there's 4 common iAction results in MVC. We've talked about 3 of them. The views, that's what we've been using by default. We can return JSON if we're building an API. We can return HTTP status codes. The other thing that we might return is a redirect. So for example, after a user saves data or logs in, we often will redirect them off to another page. So we have a redirect to an action. So we can then pass in the name of another method that we want to call when our current method is done processing. So those are our 4 common iAction result types. Maybe I'll actually make a note of that in our week 2 folder, because it's kind of attached to the controllers. The 4 common So load a page in the browser. .401 would be unauthorized. JSON. Or a redirect to action. So those are either our 4 common implementations of iAction result. So I'll just add this into our lesson 2 for reference. So hopefully that's helpful to the people who mentioned that iAction result is something that they wanted to know more about. I hope that gives you a little better picture of how we'll use it. And again, we will use it in these other ways through the course as well. So that's going to help. Okay, so we're returning an HTTP status code. Now we can come back to our create method. So we want to build a view called create. We want to generate this view. So what do you expect to see in the browser? Okay, great. Thanks, Shamandeep. Thanks for letting me know. So at this URL, /brand/create, what should we see in the browser? Okay, we will see an error right now. Yes, that's right, Adam. Okay, so Chris is saying a form. Right. We want to give the user a view that will allow them to populate a form. So we can use the templating engine to do this. So I'm going to right click my view name. I'm going to choose add a view. Now, so far when we've been adding views, we were adding empty views. This time I want to pick a razor view with or without a strongly typed model. So pick razor view and click add. The view name will automatically be called create because it matches the method name. Which template should we pick? So there's 6 templates. What is this view? Yeah, we want a create template. This is going to build an empty form. Now it's asking us, okay, you want to create something. So what model do we pick? what kind of data are we going to use this form to create? You got it. We want to create a brand. We don't have a data context class yet. We'll leave this out. We'll work with this starting next week. It's going to include the JavaScript. And then it says, do you want to use a layout page? We do, because we want to inherit our site layout with our header and footer, CSS. So I'm going to make sure I've checked off use a layout page, and then I'll click browse and go to views and shared. And we want to make sure we pick our underscore layout. So this way, this page is going to look like all the other pages in our site. If we don't use a layout page, this is going to be a complete web page with its own header and footer. We're not going to have our navigation bar, our links, and our footer. So most of our pages, we're typically going to want to use the site layout. So here are all the options. We're adding a razor view called create. Our template is also create. Our model is brand. And we're going to use our views shared layout. And then we can click add. If you are on a Mac, you may need to just through Solution Explorer. I'll show you what options you need to pick if you're on a Mac and you don't have these same pop-up options, these same templating options that you would have on Windows. So if you're on a Mac, you may have to create the view this way. You'll, in Solution Explorer, go to Views and Brands. You right-click the Brands folder, and I think you'll have to choose Add a New Item. And then you will pick a I think you have to pick Razor View. I think you pick Razor Page. Yes, a Razor Page with a page model. So you'd pick Razor Page if you're on a Mac. So now it gives us a form. Okay, cool. Well, let's see what this looks like. So now I'll go to brands/create. So now we get our form. And notice it automatically knows that year and ID are numeric. Right? We get these little doesn't look very good in Firefox. Can't seem to click the numbers. There, I can just roll through. Right? If I try and type alpha characters here, I'm surprised it let me. Okay, because it's tied to our model. Yeah. So let's go and take a quick look at our form. Notice our declaration on line 1. We have a model, a strongly typed model. It's not IEnumerable like index, which was a list, but this form is going to be tied to a single brand object. And then it automatically gives us inputs. Now we can customize this. This form may not be exactly what we want. So we can make changes to it. But we don't have to build our forms from scratch. We can use the scaffolding in Visual Studio to automatically generate them, our forms, and then we just make any changes that we want. So maybe like here, I've got a heading in H1 that says create, and then an H4 that says brand. So this looks kind of silly. Maybe I want to change this. So I'm going to change on line 8. I'm just going to change the heading that says create a new brand. And then I'll get rid of the H4 on line 10. So I just have one single heading rather than a heading and subheading that don't make a lot of sense to me. So now instead of two headings here, it'll just say create a new brand. But I'm using Visual Studio to do the heavy lifting of coding all the HTML. One of the other great things about building your forms this way and using models, using this whole MVC pattern, oh, Booger, it gets better. Gets even better. So you can see how quickly and how you can get things up and running and how productive you can be. Because Microsoft's whole philosophy when they created .NET back in, came out in 2002, was they looked at what are all of these repetitive tasks, these menial work that web developers do over and over again. And how can we automate this stuff and free them up to focus on the actual functionality and code and logic of the application, rather than doing kind of make busy grunt work like coding forms. So they also gave us simple tools for validation. So let's say, for example, we want to add some validation rules. Let's say here that we want to make the name attribute required. So if we go to our brand model, and above the name attribute, we add required in square brackets. Now notice it hasn't worked right away. We get this error, Visual Studio underlines it in red, cannot find the attribute required. You're missing a namespace or a reference. So show the potential fixes. I get this little drop down, this code hint, and it says if you want to use the required attribute, we need to make a reference to system.componentModel.data annotations. So we need this reference in order to use this required. So I'll click on that little suggestion. Pardon me. It adds a reference on line 3. I could also add that reference manually. Doesn't matter. And now it says, okay, name is required. Cool. So now I'm going to go back to my form, save my changes, go back to my form. I'll refresh it. And we can see what our model validation does. So I'll put in an ID. I'm going to leave the name blank, but I'll put in the year. And now I'll try and submit. And automatically, Visual Studio generates an error message in red telling me name field is required. As soon as I type one character, the error message goes away. So it's using jQuery and jQuery validator to do this. Adam, did you save and hit refresh? Make sure you refresh. As soon as I type a single character, the validation goes away. So we can add all kinds of validation rules. Yeah, Marilo, exactly. Let's say, for example, also, oh, good. Maybe we want, and we'll play around with these validation rules more in a couple of weeks. Maybe let's say our year founded also should have some kind of validation around it. We want to say that the year founded has to be within a certain range. Like the year founded can't be, minus 200. So let's say, I don't know, 1400. I don't think we can make this dynamic. So we can put in a minimum and a maximum. So for now, I'll just put in, 2025, so that this is dynamic into the future for a few years. So if I reload my form and try and put in a year founded that's outside of this range, right? If I put in 1399, it says, nope, invalid. So as long as we follow the MVC naming conventions and pattern, the framework will do a ton of work for us. It is great. We used to spend, I can tell you, 20 years ago when I would build web forms, the most time-consuming part was writing all the JavaScript validation, painstakingly, one field at a time, right? I got quite good at writing plain vanilla JavaScript. This was long before jQuery even existed, and I wrote tons and tons. I probably even have some old files somewhere. I should show you how crazy the JavaScript was to validate all the inputs on a form. So we'll play around with these. So these are called data annotations. So additional attributes on our model properties. So there's lots more we can do. We'll work with this some more in a few weeks, but you get the idea of what this can do. So we had not only the create template, but I'm not going to create a view, but just to show you, just to look at what the other templates were. So if I go back, I'm not going to complete this, but when I pick a view, so we could do empty without a model. So this is just going to be a static page where we just put HTML on. It's not working with any kind of data model. If we pick create, we get a blank form. If we pick delete, this will show us the data and generate a delete button. We have a details page. This is for a read-only view of the data. So something like a product detail page that we're going to do. As a customer, they will need to be able to see the details of a product, but they can't modify it. We'll have an edit view for the site administrator, so they could edit products or edit brands. And then we have our list, which would generate, using a loop, generate an HTML table with all the data in our query result. So those are our 6 templates that we can work with. Okay, so, and we will work with all of these. So this is mostly standard HTML. So we've got some server-side script here. We've declared that this interacts with a strongly typed object, a brand model. It's got a title at the top. Here we see view data. This is pretty similar to the view bag, really. Again, it's just a dictionary of keys. So in the browser, it actually says create, and then our project name. It's using our layout template. Most of this is HTML. You'll notice there's actually no method. Doesn't say method equals post. Yet at runtime, if we inspect the source of the page, it automatically gets method equals post. So this is the default in ASP.NET. When we're working in PHP, we always had to add this method equals post attribute to our forms. In .NET, you don't have to. Method's going to be post unless we say it's get. The forms also post to themselves, and we'll look at this a bit more. And then we've got this ASP4. So these bind individual form controls to the individual properties of our model. We don't have to do it manually. Yes. Adam, yes, it is. Good question. Right? We've also got the validation for. So, this is where those red error messages, if we violate any of the validation rules, it shows up in these span tags that use this ASP validation for, and that way it's linked to a particular property in the model. So each field, it automatically puts a hidden label with red text. That's this text danger class. And then we get a submit button down at the bottom. And of course, it's using Bootstrap to format all this stuff. Okay, it is 10 to 12. So we haven't done really much coding, just a little bit, but I will still push this up to GitHub. So I'll go to my Git changes and I'll say lesson 3, part 1, so scaffold, create brand form with model validation. So I will push these changes up to GitHub. So now I'll just click commit all and push. So all the new changes are on GitHub. All right, let's take a 10-minute break. I'm going to go stretch my legs. Let's go get out of our chairs for 10 minutes, and we will resume at noon.